Alex de Vries, welcome to Decrypt.
Thank you for having me.
So I'd really like to speak to you today about the new research that you've published called Bitcoin's Growing E-Waste Problem in the journal Resources, Conservation and Recycling. Alex, tell me, what is Bitcoin's Growing E-Waste Problem?
Well, the current problem is about 30 metric kilotons in size. That's at least our estimate for what this network is putting out annually in terms of electronic waste, which, by the way, translates to around 272 grams of electronic waste per processed transaction on average. And the thing is, in Bitcoin, people are running highly specialized equipment. If you want to do Bitcoin mining, you can't just use any machine because it's just not competitive. So people use ASIC-based devices, ASIC standing for application-specific integrated circuits. And as implied by that name, those machines can only do one single task very well, meaning Bitcoin mining, and they can't do anything else. Now, that by itself isn't even the problem, but it starts becoming a problem when you realize that when you're mining, your biggest expense is electricity. If you're running these machines, you have to pay for the electricity to run them. And what you want is you always want to have the most efficient machine so that you minimize your energy cost component. And over the past years, sorry about that, these miners or these people have constantly developed new, more powerful machines. But as newer generations fill up the network, older device types become unprofitable. And they are not able to compete with the newer generation anymore. And at some point, pretty quickly, we quantify in 1.3 years on average, they just become economically obsolete. And at that point, there's nothing else you can do with them because they're single-purpose machines. So because of that, you end up with this pile of electronic waste. That's the root cause. You have a very big incentive to use single-purpose machines. It's the most efficient, but also a very big incentive to just keep on generating or producing new, more powerful equipment at the expense of these older generations. And that's what leading to this pile of electronic waste at the end.
Right, brilliant. Thank you for that, Alex. And one thing that I found really curious when I read through your research was that the current level of Bitcoin's e-waste is essentially comparable to the IT equipment waste, I think is how you described it, that's been produced by the Netherlands to date. Can you expand on that a little bit? And we've seen, obviously, Bitcoin's energy consumption has previously been compared to the annual consumption of electricity in terms of different countries and their sizes before. So can you expand a little bit on that? And also, I'm curious to know why, in particular, you calculated your research on Bitcoin's e-waste per transaction. Can you tell me a little bit about why that was important?
Sure. Well, let's first talk about the generic metrics. If we divide, or we can generally divide e-waste in different categories, one of them being small IT and telecommunications equipment, which includes things like phones, printers, laptops. Well, you have several other categories, which include screens and such, or large IT equipment. In any case, we noticed that for a country like the Netherlands, they're putting out 30 metric kilotons of this small IT equipment waste every year. And it's somewhat a relatable situation when we look at energy consumption, because actually also for energy consumption, we see that the network is consuming the same or more than a country like the Netherlands. So it's not that surprising when you find that, hey, also in terms of electronic waste, you can compare it to the same country. It's just that nobody done that before. But I think that if you really think about it, it's actually not that surprising that you find this to be the case, because ultimately it's not just electricity that you need all these specialized equipment to actually produce those Bitcoin blocks and produce all the computations that are going on in the network. So it's logical if you think about it, but of course, if you haven't, then it can be a big number by surprise.
So This is an interesting discussion I think that we should have as well. Is there any position that you take on what's a more urgent problem, let's say, that's facing Bitcoin or the wider crypto community more generally? We obviously, we all have heard the stories about Bitcoin's electrical consumption that we've just discussed briefly now, and its resulting carbon footprint as well. So this is, I suppose, just a specific niche of its impact on the environment. Would you consider that, albeit just a part of its wider damage to the environment, that it's a more urgent problem than the rest? Would that be a valid thing to say, or do you think it's maybe not as important as the wide, broader scheme of Bitcoin in terms of its carbon footprint?
Well, I think all these issues are important, and actually the first issue doesn't even start, it doesn't start with energy, doesn't start with electronic waste. It starts the moment the Bitcoin price goes up and people want more machines, and that just adds to the global chip shortage, because you can only use a chip one time. You can put it into a Bitcoin miner or some other device. So the first impact you feel is in the global semiconductor supply chain. Then those machines start running, and obviously there's CO2 emissions related to the energy consumption of those machines. And then at the end of the line, that's when you're left with the electronic waste, which is also a little bit of a carbon issue, because a lot of electronic waste ends up being incinerated. But a bigger problem with electronic waste is that there's just a bunch of toxic materials in these electronic devices that cause air pollution, that leach into the soil, leach into the water. So it's directly impacting human health. And I think that if every part of this is an issue. And of course, there is a very big focus on carbon emissions. When we talk about climate change, we talk about carbon emissions. And a lot of media attention is also focused on that part, but that doesn't change that, you know, we're dealing with all these other things at the same time. There is a global chip shortage. There is also a massive pile of electronic waste globally growing. Also a very big problem, because hardly any e-waste, I'm not just talking about Bitcoin e-waste, but e-waste in general just gets very little attention, and only 15% of electronic devices are recycled. So also that is an issue, and I can imagine that it's hard for media to cover everything at the same time, but it is something that we need to address everything at the same time.
And it seems as though, judging by your research as well, it's at least implied that this problem could actually get a lot worse in the future. Just a stat that I'll put to you from your own work here, that Bitcoin could produce almost 65 metric kilotons of e-waste at its peak price. Say, for the sake of argument, Bitcoin reaches a new all-time high in the next 3 months. It's above 60K, and it reaches 70 or 80K. Judging by your research, does that imply actually that its e-waste footprint actually gets bigger and this becomes a bigger issue?
Yes, well, actually, in the research, we state that the e-waste amount can actually already double. We specifically state based on price level seen earlier this year, but that was before the Bitcoin price recovered back to its current level. So actually, we mean at the current level, the e-waste footprint can double. Although, of course, the situation today may may change that a little bit. But generally speaking, this is a growing issue, because still Bitcoin mining is hugely profitable. People are getting more machines, and that means two things. It means, first of all, well, actually three things. It means that we're now straining the global semiconductor supply chain. Secondly, it means more energy consumption in the future, and very near future. And thirdly, it means that also the amount of e-waste is just going to go up.
Right. And let's talk a little bit about solutions. What in your view can be done about this growing problem? Is this a question for governments and regulators and essentially external parties to clamp down on the way that Bitcoin is currently mined, or is this something that you think could be solved from within? Say the Bitcoin community could recognize that this is an issue, and it can work again from within to actually soften Bitcoin's damage to the environment. Is that something that is plausible to you? Or, as I said, is this something that is down to external parties to solve?
So ideally, the change would come from within. And I personally believe that the only optimal solution is to just take out the proof of work mining entirely and try to replace it with a more sustainable alternative. And of course, in that context, we often talk about proof of stake. I don't want to sound like a massive proof of stake advocate, but obviously, when we talk about sustainable alternatives, that's the one we talk about most, also because Ethereum happens to be planning to switch from proof of work to proof of stake. Well, there is a lot of caveats to making such a change, but in any case, if you make such a change, then environmental impact will no longer be a concern, because that alternative does not require highly specialized energy consuming hardware. There's no competition going on in that sense. So the only thing you need there is just a device with an internet connection, and then you eliminate both the energy consumption plus the electronic waste. It's the entire environmental impact is just solved in one go. That's the perfect solution. Now, like I said, it's a bit more complicated than that, because you're not just talking about the environment when you're talking about making a change like this. It's also a security matter. It's not easy to get such a thing implemented regardless. Even if you agree on the technical solution, nobody can force it. There is nobody in charge of the network. So ultimately, anyone would have to decide, okay, we're now going to run this new solution to handy proof of work problem. But yeah, it's definitely not going to be easy to realize. And then you start looking externally, what can what can you expect from policymakers as this problem grows, or as the energy consumption goes up and the electronic waste goes up? We already saw China specifically banning cryptocurrency mining, citing environmental concerns. Bitcoin miners were indirectly responsible for idle coal mines being reopened, and China was just done with it, especially as that was happening illegally, and there were also a bunch of safety incidents directly leading to the loss of human lives. So they didn't want it anymore. But of course, on top of that, they completely banned cryptocurrencies altogether. So they went a little bit over the top of what's needed to address this specific issue. But I don't think it's unrealistic that other countries will consider similar steps at some point, because ultimately everyone has agreed to certain climate targets. And of course, they realize that, you have a sector, a rapidly growing sector, taking an increasing part of global emissions, one, but also global electronic waste. That's another thing to consider. And yeah, they might start thinking, hey, maybe we should also do something like banning cryptocurrency mining, or in the worst case, banning investments in these cryptocurrencies. Hey, if you can't tackle the mining directly, you can try to target the price of these assets. If the Bitcoin price is zero, simply said, miners will not earn any money, so they won't be spending anything on energy and resources, or they simply will not have the means to. Now, it's not realistic, I think, at this point in time, and also very hard, because if one country decides to enforce this, but the rest of the world doesn't, people can still put their money into this asset. So it's something that needs to be done around the world, and coordinating that by itself is also a massive issue. But it's becoming increasingly likely as this presents a growing part of our global waste, global emissions. Mm-hmm. And I think the community just needs to be aware that that will ultimately hold Bitcoin back, and to prevent the network from growing further if all governments start to intervene in such a way. But yeah, I currently don't see any movement yet to change this from within, at least for Bitcoin. Ethereum is working on it, mm-hmm. but Bitcoin so far not yet.
Right, and just to add a little bit of the discussion here regarding China, obviously, as you mentioned, China has placed a ban on Bitcoin mining, crypto mining generally. And we've seen, obviously, since then that miners have emigrated essentially to other jurisdictions. We've seen a bit of a Bitcoin mining boom in the States. There's been a lot of talk about Kazakhstan as well. And you mentioned, of course, that different countries have got different climate commitments that are going to be coming down the line over the next few years. Would you say, if you can say, by and large, the fact that China has placed a ban on crypto mining and that this industry is now sort of proliferating elsewhere, is that a net positive or a net negative for Bitcoin's impact on the environment?
Well, sadly, probably a net negative, because the thing is, in China, they were moving around. They were using coal, but they were only using that for part of the year. And then during the summertime, they were indeed using hydropower, which, at least in terms of CO2 emissions, is negligible. So if you average it out, yeah, it's not great, but it's not the worst either. Whereas if you now have these miners moving to, well, especially a location like Kazakhstan, they'll just be running on coal all year long. That's definitely not an improvement, but also a very popular destination, or at least what we read about is that a big part of these machines might move to Alberta, Canada. They have a bunch of natural gas over there. Well, if Bitcoin miners would be using natural gas all year round, then it's still not an improvement versus the situation we had in China on average. So I think in terms of carbon emissions, it's not a positive. It might not be getting a whole lot worse depending on the location. If they're moving to Kazakhstan primarily, then yes, it is getting a lot worse. We still have to see how these movements have shaped up, and it's still too early to say that. Cambridge has been tracking it, but they only provided data up to April, so we have to see in the next update how this has actually affected the network. But yeah, it's unlikely to improve that situation. And then, part of the reasons why we did this EWaste research is also that people are talking a lot about, well, this network might be using more renewables, it might even become 100% green, but then people often forget that no amount of green energy, even if it was possible, will address this second issue being e-waste. You can't fix it with green energy. So yeah, I think on the whole, China's ban is not helping so far. And we'll have to see what other countries do, but it's too early to tell.
Yeah, fair enough. And in terms of just one last question that I have here for you, Alex, just to throw another figure back at you from your research, you mentioned that 272 grams of e-waste is produced per Bitcoin transaction. Is there any way that you can contextualize that for us and compare it to another metric that might be easier to imagine for folks watching?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's on average. So we just looked at, okay, this is the amount of electronic waste a year, and then this is the amount of transactions that's happening. So relative to each other, you end up with a big amount of electronic waste per transaction. 272 grams is something that a lot of people can easily relate to. For example, it's comparable to 2 iPhone 12 mini devices or about half an iPad. And I think many people will be able to relate to that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, with that then, Alex, I'm going to thank you for your time. We appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll speak to you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex.